Hey, welcome. This is The Process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 124, my third and final lesson for my annual tight end deep metrics. Please go and start with actually the quarterback, RBs, and then come here. But basically, I've described why I do this deep metrics, and then you can take that into account and we'll talk later about draft plans in the summer, and I'll have some more discussion about that. But anyway, it's important to chop the wood and then get the fire, and I continue that journey with some deeper metrics here. So let me move to the first page. Okay, so first page here, first data metrics is something called rank sector. I've discussed this plenty of times in the previous lessons, but once again, imagine take all the data and cut it to four parts. The top part is the 75th to 100 percentile. That's the highest, the best tight ends year in and year out will be found in this segment. And then you have three other parts that are the lesser tight ends and the lesser fantasy point, etc. productions here. And of course, I have a landscape view looking to year 2000 to last year, 2021. I like to understand that. And I have average of fantasy points, average of receptions, reception yards, yards per reception, and reception tight end TDs there on average. And again, this is now looking not at all tight ends every year, but just the best tight ends. And the numbers of tight ends has increased from the year 2000 to 2021. So we definitely have seen that, and we discussed that in the previous lessons. So 2000, the average fantasy point was 115, and then last year was 129. So we're getting many more points than usual, almost 15 points more per average tight end. But we have seen the golden age of tight ends, 2009 to 15, maybe even 2016. So we are not in the best time for tight ends, but we're not in the worst of times either. Nothing here suggests that 2022 will be anything different than the preceding probably 3 years here. We did have a lull in 2018, but nothing dramatic. Average receptions peaked in 2012. Fantasy points peaked in 2011. And last year's 50 points versus, 50 receptions on average versus 56. It's lower, and we're in that kind of area, but again, nothing dramatic here. Yards, it peaked in 2011, and we're, at 656.8, and then last year was 551, so about 100 yards less per top tight end. Remember, more tight ends, there's more in that percentile, so that's some of it. There's just more tight ends there, and so that's why that average is probably lower than 2011, but still nothing dramatic. Yards per reception has gone down. Last year kind of cratered below 11, and we hadn't seen that since 2012. So that was a little bit of an issue. I don't think we're going to get close to 12 ever again, yards per reception. But 10 or 11 close is not bad. Tight end touchdowns, about 4 per average tight end per year. That's probably reasonable. So that means on average, even the best tight ends are only getting you what, touchdown every 4 games. So if your tight end needs touchdowns to make them relevant, that's not good. This is in PPR, so the best tight ends are catching a lot of passes as well as every once in a while getting touchdowns on average. So tight ends that can catch touchdowns is probably can be a little misleading versus opportunities. So I would swing towards understanding yardage and opportunities probably more than touchdowns, which are a little bit more variable. And I think people know that lesson, and I don't think there's too much to surprise. Now, I will say amongst the more new fantasy players, sometimes they get enamored too much with touchdowns. And every year we always have a tight end or two that seem to got an extreme amount of touchdowns. I believe Tanyan a few years ago was one of those, and he really hasn't returned to that level. People talk about regression of the mean to the mean and these kind of things. The concept is just saying you cannot live on the extremes all the time. The law of big numbers will catch up with you. And so I'm looking more at potential opportunities for this year, right? So you have to imagine how a team's used tight ends before and these kind of things. So this is kind of static and of course, past won't change, right? People can interpret it differently, right? Historians do all the time, but the past doesn't change, but the future could be different than we envision. So it's always a little tricky there. So if you look at the metrics here of yards and reception and TDs, we see kind of ups and downs, and I'm not sure really things have changed a lot in the last couple of years. And the yards has gone up, but it's crashed in recent years, so that is a little bit of a concern. But I think what's happening is we're getting more and more tight ends getting a little share of the opportunities. So teams are diversifying and using multiple tight end sets more than they ever have. And so that can confound us and can muddy the water to try, and be super successful at tight ends when you get the extreme, catches from an unknown tight end, right? That helps no one was the mantra cry of these extreme, seldom scoring tight ends that wake up and decide they're going to have a game. And certainly in daily fantasy, scoring, if you can predict that, good things can happen to your bankroll, but that's hard to do, needless to say. But anyway, we've kind of been in a steady plateau, but have declined recently. I think that we will stay below the golden age because more and more tight ends are being used for that, not just blockers, but they can pass catch, especially in the red zone, I believe. So it's always important to look across at 21 years, but the next slides, I'm only going to look at the last 3. So this is closer to what a lot of the pundits are using, and it's understandable. At what point down the road does, old quote data gets stale and is not applicable to now. So with that in mind, I went ahead and divided my data into year sectors, and this is 2019 to 2021, and the top tight ends in that group. So the last 3 years and only the top 25% tight ends. So the best of the best. And I looked at experience sectors from rookies, year 2, 3, 4, 5. That's why the R means rookie plus, the second year, the third year, and so forth. So we're looking at experience years. average fantasy points are peaking probably at year 6. Okay, and you're saying, what about year 9? I think the amount of tight ends are so rare that are staying in the league at 9 years, that can be a little misleading. So be aware of those extremes in year 9 and 10. So for me, the peak is at year 6. I will tell you that 21 years of data has put the peak at year 7. What I think we're seeing is a movement back to peaking earlier in the last 3 years. So that is a potential aspect for dynasty here. And it's a little disconcerting. Year 5 was really just off the charts. But year 4, we were close to that 140 fantasy points. So one has to assume when something looks strange that, just be aware of it. Don't hide it. Don't ignore it, but just think of, the year 4 and 6 probably implies that the year 5 data in the last 3 years is a little bit skewed. But I'm thinking year 6 is the peak now, not year 7, even though that was for 21 years. So I think tight ends are peaking a year earlier than we're used to, if you've played fantasy football. So that can skew things a little bit. And I would definitely get worried by year 8 that, things are really going to go downhill for even some of the top tight ends. So age is catching up with them. So for dynasty, you probably want to consider jettisoning them in their 8th year. Okay, so that's, I think, what it's saying. The receptions, I think that data is saying about the same thing. Reception yards, maybe a little bit even peakier at year 4, but certainly year 6 is okay. And then yards per reception has gone down and really peaks early. And so you're getting, I think, some youthfulness to some of these ascending tight ends, year 3 and 4, and they're really putting on a show and are able with fresh young legs to maybe get a few extra yards. Whereas the older seasoned tight ends, maybe they're they savvy enough that, you just can't hurdle everybody and get that extra few yards. So there is some youthfulness in this data, I think, for yards per reception. And touchdowns peaking at year 6 as well. That's probably, I think, the seasoning aspect, that the older tight ends are knowing a few more juking tricks maybe, and they're able to produce more year 6, 7 maybe. But again, 9 and 10, I do understand, and when I colorize the data, it's showing these extreme numbers, but I think that's the number of tight ends in those categories is what is confounding us with this data. And if we look at the average yards and notice that yards, it's really year 4. And if we look at the blue touchdowns, year 6, but again, I'm kind of ignoring 9 and 10. And the fantasy points, probably 4, maybe 6. And then receptions, it's getting a little bit skewy, but I think year 6. So there may even be some push for year 4 that these young tight ends are really enhancing their activity at year 3 and 4. And maybe that's the new peak. So I would consider 4, 5, and 6. I would definitely think that by year 7 and 8, that's going to be on a decline And you're saying, what about these in year 9 and 10? I think you're talking so few that it's going to stand out who these are. Things like Kelsey and whatnot. And, I'm not worried about those. But some of the average tight ends are at the bottom of this sector. I would definitely be getting worried about the age factor there. But I think I'm comfortable 4 to 6 year, but 4 could be telling us there's some peaking going on there. So I think that has changed, and curious to see. It's hard to imagine you're going to peak in year 3. I mean, I don't know. I'll look at the data next year as well. We'll see. But right now, I think I'm confident to say that year 4 to 6, those are the peak years for tight ends in the last 3 years. And I just want to show you all the numbers. These are declining. And so by year 9, you're only got a fourth of who was left. Year 10, and certainly by year 11, you've got a 10th left. So far out here, you're getting such skewed data that you just cannot really rely on those numbers. Those averages are going to be so skewed in that 21 years, of data here. So take that with a grain of salt and just understand that, there is a decline as well and a decay of the number of tight ends in the league. So if a tight end has made it out here, they're probably really beating the average. They're going to be major impact, and they're getting contracts out in here. That's quite spectacular. So just, be aware of some of these old dogs that are hanging around. Don't turn them down for redraft for sure. I can understand dynasty, but for redraft, I'm not so scared of these older let's call them super seasoned experienced players. Okay, that's my finish for tight end deep metrics, and we'll move on to wide receivers. This is Dr. Bush for the process. Thanks for listening. Come back. This is extra fun.